Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about adaptation and reception studies. Now, technically, these are two different disciplines. They aren't quite the same thing, but they're similar enough that, for my purposes, especially for the kind of work that I personally do, I'm gonna talk about them together. So, adaptation studies and reception studies both have to do with what we make of the past, or what we make of materials from the past, cultural materials, particularly literature, but also mythology, history, major events, figures from the past, things like this. What do they mean to us today, or how do we use them today to construct meaning? Adaptation studies basically deals with questions about how we alter usually canonical texts to make meaning for contemporary purposes. So, for instance, when Tom Stoppard rewrites Hamlet into Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, he's doing that in a specific way to try and make meaning or to understand or engage with the cultural and ideological politics of the 1960s when that play is written. We have a lot of contemporary feminist rewritings of fairy tales, of ancient mythology, of Shakespeare, etc., etc. We have a lot of post-colonial rewritings of Shakespeare, of Greek drama, of these different in francophone post-colonial context, plays by people like Molière, Rancière, Corneille, etc., etc. So we have these revisions of things, reimaginings of things that point us toward particular shortcomings or cultural problems with those original texts. Things that maybe characters who are left out, or characters whose voices aren't considered. There's a scholar named Jeremy Rawson. I couldn't remember his first name for a second. I wanted to say Josh, but no, it's Jeremy Rawson. He's theorized what he called minor character elaboration, which is a particular genre of adaptation studies in which authors re-envision major texts, major stories, plays, myths, fairy tales, whatever it is, from the perspectives of characters who are silent or even absent. So, Anne Claycomb, for instance, has a novel called The Mermaid's Daughter, where she sort of rethinks the story of Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid from the perspective, actually, of the descendant of the mermaid, but we get the mermaid's side of things. So, this is essentially what adaptation studies is about. It's how do we... adaptation studies involves looking at how contemporary writers revise or reimagine older canonical texts to express contemporary values, contemporary ideas, things like this. So again, what role do women play in Greek mythology, for instance? This is something that might be explored in an adaptation. Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, for instance. What is the role of racism in Othello? I mean, this is a thing a lot of contemporary adapters have taken on Othello. People like Janet Sears and Joseph Jomo Pierre, for instance. What does Othello look like when we approach it from a 20th or 21st century perspective on race? And so this is what adaptation studies is basically about, is what are the ways in which contemporary artists, adapters, dramatists, writers, whatever it is, engage with these canonical materials. Reception studies is slightly different because reception studies looks at the original source materials themselves and tries to figure out what is the importance of this document and how is this document understood in contemporary culture. So we might look at So, for instance, this guy named David Leeming, who has this book called Medusa in the Mirror of Time. And basically he traces the history of receptions of the Medusa myth. He starts by looking at sort of pre-Medusa figures that existed in the ancient Near East, in Egypt, and in Proto-Greek culture. Minoan culture and things like this. Then he looks at Medusa in the Greek and Roman context. How is Medusa understood in the medieval context, in the Renaissance, in the Romantic era, in the Neoclassical era, in the Victorian era? How is she understood in the 20th century, in the 21st century, etc., etc. So that sort of notion that there's a continuum of what people understand particular texts or myths or figures to mean. That's basically what reception studies is interested in. And there's the sort of presentist version of reception studies. What does this mean to us today? How do we today understand the figure of Odysseus or King Solomon or Beowulf or whatever it is? But then there's also, again, that sort of historical approach. How did people in X time period, the Renaissance or whatever it was, understand these figures? And then that, of course, raises the next sort of thing is, what does it tell us today about the way that, about the medieval period, for instance, that they understood Medusa or whatever it is in this particular way? So reception study, and you can do the same thing with adaptation studies as well. Actually, there is a sort of historical component to this as well, because if we look back at, say, Richard Mansfield's theater adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Mansfield's theater production came out 1 year after Stevenson's novella, but it's a very different text. And so looking at those two things, looking at how Mansfield adapted Stevenson's novella, tells us something about that adaptation process, about, in this case, intermedial adaptation. That is, adaptation between two different media. So in this case, between a novella and a stage. What did the stage need to do in the 19th century that Stevenson didn't need to do in the novella? That's an important thing that tells us a lot about that cultural time period. But then we can again look at contemporary adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde. There's a lot of play versions of it. There's a lot of film versions of it, novel versions, etc., etc. And these tell us about the contemporary moment. So this is essentially what adaptation studies and reception studies is interested in, is how we navigate the influence of canonical texts, historical figures, myths, ideas, etc., etc. What do we make of these things, and what does it tell us that we understand these texts in these particular ways?